Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this entire idea of junk volume. And I had someone ask me on one of my live streams today, they're like, look, how do we know if we're getting into junk volume? And is junk volume always a problem? And that's really the interesting question on the junk volume. I think that's the one that really plagued us, is not so much just, are we into junk volume? Is junk volume always a problem? Meaning, for those who don't understand, junk volume is training that probably doesn't have any training response. In other words, any lifting that you're doing in the gym that isn't stimulating any change in the body, right? Isn't stimulating change in the body. Because even if you're trying to maintain, you can very quickly reach a point to where you do need at least a small amount of stimulus just to keep the muscle and strength that you have. Okay, so you probably do need at least a little bit of novel training response for an adaptation. And if you don't get that, you're eventually going to regress. So, the thing is, what I find that we have to think about with that is, one, is it interfering with our recovery? Two, is it interfering with our life when we're asking about junk volume? Okay, because that's not always the case. In other words, some people have a really high work capacity. Some people have a really high recovery. Okay, and I think that's an important thing to think about when we think about junk volume. You have to think about that. Some people's lifestyle, their genetics, everything that they're doing may actually allow them to do a lot of junk volume without it being a problem for their recovery. Now, does injury risk potentially go up? It might. Do we get possible inflammation that may create some extra soreness we don't want? Yeah, possibly. Do we also get then that illusion of fake gains? And does sometimes it lead into, eventual overtraining? Okay, because we need to keep that in mind. Overtraining is not a short-term thing. That should almost be its own topic. Overtraining is something that creeps up over an extended period of time. So people have this thing, they don't understand overtraining syndrome. They're like, well, overtraining, you're overtraining. Well, no, you're not overtraining. You're not overtraining until you reach an overtrained condition in the body. You might be overreaching. You might be exceeding your recovery by a small amount. Okay. But you may not be overtraining. Once you go into overtraining, you start regressing. Okay, let me be clear on that. You are not in an overtrained condition if you're keeping all your performance and strength. In other words, if you can lift 315 for 6 reps and you can still lift it for 5 or 6, you're not overtraining. When you are truly overtrained, if 5 or 6 reps is your max with 315 on an exercise, I'm just throwing an arbitrary number out there, by the way. You may not be able to do 1 rep. You might get stapled on the first rep or the second rep all of a sudden. Okay. I've had people who could do 5 reps for 315 on an exercise who, when they reach a true overtrained state, they might get stapled with 275 on the first rep. Now that's overtraining. Okay, that's a good indication. But let's jump into the other thing. Also, then there's the time component, the energy, the other resources. So what do we mean by junk volume? Like, how can you start to tell? I'm going to say the number one thing is going to be performance. Like, some people say things like, well, you're no longer getting a pump or any of that. Maybe. And there may be some truth to that. But what I would really look at is going to be performance. Okay? And here's where I'm about to go. All right, perfect example. This isn't quite there like what you see here. These 2 sets were done back to back. You'll see it in the background. I did 555 for a triple on the deadlift. Yes, as an old man with a gray beard. And then as a back down set, I did 505, but I stopped at 3 reps. It just felt too heavy. I didn't feel like I could have done more than 1, maybe 2 more reps at the most. So there's performance degrading a little bit there, but we're not into junk volume yet. Why? Because usually to get a training response, I think the effective rep theory is probably largely true. And I don't think it is a perfect thing. I think it's a little bit arbitrary, but it's not a bad benchmark. About 4 to 5 reps from failure. In other words, any set that you do that isn't within 4 to 5 reps of failure is probably not stimulating muscle growth. Okay? Now there's your metric. Why? Because that's where we're hitting the upper threshold muscle fibers. Okay, now if we're not recovering set to set, or we're just doing too much work in a workout, what happens? The upper threshold muscle fibers are no longer recruiting. Ooh, All right, now we're getting somewhere. Now we have something to work with. Why? Because when you start reaching work sets to where you can't replicate performance, because that's going to happen. I mean, most of the time, let's say, you take a weight that 10 reps is really hard. You maybe could squeeze out 1/11th if you really tried, right? Maybe you get 10 on the first set. Second set, you get 10 and it gets real hard, right? Third set, you might get 8. Like maybe you're grinding that 10th rep on the second set. Then you get like 8 and you can't even get a 9th rep. Yeah. That's still a good training response. Why? Because you figured that was at most maybe an 11 rep max fresh, right? Well, 8 reps is still within 4 or 5 of that number, right? You got to drop down to about 6 or 7. But that you're still handling that weight for 8. We're still getting a training response, and especially if it was a really hard set, right? So there were still a few upper threshold muscle fibers still there. The deep fibers were still able to grow. Okay, so that's a good indication. What happens if you only get 6 or 7? Now we're into junk volume. We're not getting anything out of this anymore. Could you extrapolate that into your later exercises, right? If you have done 3 different exercises for a muscle, people say, well, how do I track it then? We're getting tired. You look at it and go, if I was fresh, could I have done more? In other words, you got 10 reps with a weight that on a good fresh movement, you could have done 15 plus. That on a good day, you're capable of 15 plus. But people will hear that and they'll say, okay, but if I reached failure, didn't I stimulate it? No, because you reached failure from the weaker fibers. Now, if you're still a kind of a novice lifter, yeah, that's still causing some growth. You've been training a few years, probably not. Okay, and here's why those deep fibers matter. The longer you train, every year that you train consistently and make gains, the more that your muscle growth only comes from the deeper muscle fibers. The more intermediate fibers stop growing through the different types, and they grow less and less and less the longer you get advanced. This is why your gains slow down. Eventually you get to where only those deeper muscle fibers are growing at all. Usually if you've been training really hard, like 5+ years, you're not getting muscle growth from the other stuff unless you just went on a bunch of stuff. And you guys know what I mean by stuff. I'm talking drugs. Okay? So you could use junk volume to extrapolate that. That if you knew that fresh, you're using a weight that you could have gotten more than 5 reps with that same weight on that exercise. I don't care if it's a deadlift or a dumbbell curl. Right? The idea is the same. We're probably getting into junk volume at that point. So at that point, it's probably fair to say the muscle that you're trying to work isn't getting any new muscle growth. It's probably done. How many sets is that going to take? I don't know. That's going to depend on your work capacity, your strength, your recovery, how good a shape you're in, all these other factors. But that number is a good idea to tell you that you're getting into that area.